Deforestation is the action of clearing a wide area of trees. But let's find out more about this.
What is deforestation? Deforestation is the decrease in forest areas around the world which provides humans with wood. Deforestation occurs because of the need for space, and this new space is used for crops, mining activities, as well as to build buildings. An example of us using deforestation to build buildings would be Chicago. Chicago used to be covered in swampland, but that was all cleared to establish buildings such as the homes that you guys live in. Since 1960, deforestation has been speeding up negative effects on natural ecosystems, biodiversity, and the climate. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that the annual rate of deforestation is around 800,000 miles squared per decade. That's a lot considering that Earth has 57.5 million miles squared of land, and 800,000 miles squared per decade is a lot because that's 1/60th of all the land on Earth. And a lot of that land is already being used for other purposes. So pretty soon, if the current rate of deforestation continues, we're not going to have any trees left. So this picture is an example of deforestation. On the right, there's a bunch of trees, and then on the left, the land is pretty much all cleared, and this is just what it looks like after a land has been cleared. And it's pretty drastic, just considering the difference between those two. There's like barely any trees left on the left, and the right is covered in a forest, and it just shows how easily that trees are able to be cut down.
So some causes of deforestation include agriculture, which is the #1 cause. And agriculture amounts for up to 80% of deforestation in the whole world, and 33% of agricultural deforestation comes from subsistence agriculture, which is a form of farming in which nearly all of the crops or livestock produced are used to maintain the farmer and the farmer's family, which means that little surplus is left for selling or trading. And an example of this is if you had your own garden at home. And roughly 40% of agriculture comes from commercial farming, and that's where producing crops and farm animals are for profit, and it usually involves the use of modern technology. An example of this is the food you get in the supermarket. And new constructions cause up to 10% of deforestation in the world, and urbanization, which is the process of rural communities growing to form cities, that amounts for 5% of deforestation in the world. And by 2050, around 68% of the world is expected to live in cities, which means more deforestation will unfortunately occur.
Joseph. Sorry. So the causes of deforestation are logging companies, mining companies, and forest fires. Logging companies do clear cutting in forests, and they take lots of trees down and use them for stuff such as building houses and getting paper. Mining companies, they clear land in order to dig sites for mining so that they can do things such as coal mine or do gold mining, but we also lose a lot of forested land through that. And then another thing is forest fires. So forest fires, they result in the loss of a lot of trees, and at the end of a forest fire, a lot of those trees are dead, and so they die, and so that would result in a clear cut of land.
So this is an infographic that depicts the major causes of deforestation that we explained. So the top one being agricultural activities, and then it's followed by logging, then urbanization, desertification, which we didn't talk about, but desertification is when there's a drought and so all the trees just begin to die, and then also mining as well as forest fires.
So the history of deforestation. About 90% of recorded deforestation on Earth occurred before the 1950s. This is because trees have been used to build shelters for thousands of years, so it's been happening for a very, very long time. Earlier, humans began cutting trees with simple tools, such as the stone hatchet, just because they didn't have the efficient technological tools that we have today. So it was a lot harder for them to cut down as much as we are able to today. The steady growth of population from 9,000 to 5,000 BCE in the European forests created extensive land clearings in these areas to build early civilizations and homes. And so this just resulted in a lot of deforestation over time.
So the invention of metal saws and later on power saws greatly accelerated the ability to clear land. And since the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, forests have constantly been exploited worldwide. And this is because during the Industrial Revolution, mass production and factories became a lot more widespread. And since there was a lot more modern technology, it became a lot more easier for all of these forests to be cut down. And the American pioneers that pushed forward into the West were used to cutting trees since it was an integral part of everyday life. And you can see here in this map that in 1940, 75% of Costa Rica was covered in forests, and that percentage goes down over time, except in 1997, it starts to increase slightly, and that's because more forests and trees begin to start growing, which does actually help fight the rate of deforestation, but it's not enough because if you look at 2010, it's 52.38%, which is not as much as 75% in 1940. And also keep in mind that the current rate of deforestation is cutting down forests at a rate of 36 football fields per minute. So we have a lot to combat. And okay.
So the environmental effects of deforestation. Deforestation is a major contributor to global warming and is attributed to cause about 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The loss of many trees and plant life means that CO2 in the atmosphere is less CO2 in the atmosphere is able to be taken up. And so it's very important to note because plants act as carbon sinks because they absorb the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They use it to produce oxygen as well as other things for themselves. And this oxygen is then used by us as humans. But without there being a lot of trees, or at least the foliage part of trees, the leaves and the green parts, the CO2 can't be taken up. And that causes more emissions to be built up in the atmosphere rather than in the plants. Many animals and organisms are also losing their habitats due to deforestation, and it's approximated that 70% of land species live in forests. And then also deforested areas are also very dry and cannot support plant life because water in the air is not able to return to the soil. So dry areas such like forests no longer have plants or trees. So none of the water, there's no moisture there because nothing is being, provided in the atmosphere. And this causes the land to become desolate and dry and unable to be used again because of the conditions that are brought about to the soil.
Environmental effects of deforestation. Due to trees compacting the soil and allowing the soil to take up large amounts of water, the loss of trees due to deforestation leads to soil erosion and coastal flooding. Soil erosion is caused by the loss of compact soil, which means that the soil can be picked up easier by the wind and blown away, and we lose that soil when it's eroded. And coastal flooding is caused by the water no longer being able to absorb into the soil. So it can no longer, that means that it can freely move through it instead of be absorbed by the soil. And that just means that the soil no longer has a capability of taking up any more water.
So, deforestation around the world, indigenous peoples such as those who live in the Amazon rainforest are greatly affected by deforestation. In the Amazon, 17% of the rainforest has been depleted in as little as 50 years. And the hotspots of deforestation include tropical areas in South America, Africa, and Australia.
The health effects of deforestation. So protecting forests aligns with protecting human lives, as forests reduce the impacts of pollution, storms, as well as the spread of diseases. Deforestation is responsible for the spread of many infectious diseases because soil erosion creates the perfect conditions for breeding grounds of mosquitoes. So with this, all of the erosion happening, the mosquitoes are in a favorable environment. And when organisms sense that they're in a favorable environment, they start to reproduce more frequently because the conditions are just right for them to prosper and grow well. As well as species that are able to live in a wide range of environments, such as rodents, are known to be carriers of the diseases and can thrive in deforested areas and create a large population that eventually spreads to humans. So, as we all know, especially for the bubonic plague, rats would carry it, and rats can also use the soil to burrow and live in when there's not that many trees, because when there's not a lot of trees, there's not a lot of predators, since there's not anything for organisms like herbivores to eat. So the predators will find other areas to locate to have the best possible way of living. So I would say not bottom tier, but other organisms that are maybe more pesty, like rodents and mosquitoes and bugs that spread diseases, are more likely to be found since there aren't apex predators eating them.
Deforestation and climate change. When trees are cleared, we lose a massive carbon sink, which means that more CO2 goes back into the atmosphere. So basically, like we touched on last lesson, we talked about how ocean is a carbon sink. A lot of CO2 goes into the ocean that contributes to ocean acidification. In the same way, we have carbon sinks in forests. So CO2 will go absorb into plants because plants such as trees, they use them to create glucose. They don't eat other animals. They rely on producing their own food through photosynthesis. And in order for photosynthesis to work, they require CO2. And so when all those plants and trees die, all the carbon that they've absorbed over time, that will go back into the atmosphere. So we not only lose an ability to absorb that carbon from the atmosphere and prevent a further larger amount of CO2 being prevalent in the atmosphere, we also emit carbon back into the atmosphere, which is really bad because it contributes to global warming as carbon, CO2, it's a greenhouse gas, meaning it traps heat. The livestock and crops that replace the cleared forests are part of agribusinesses that contribute to climate change. Livestock contributes to methane, greenhouse gas that is 28 times more drastic effect on global warming than CO2. So because methane is so much more potent, which means for each molecule of CO2, a molecule of methane has a 28 times more drastic ability to take up heat, and it takes up heat and contributes to global warming and increases the temperature. So crop production requires a lot of CO2 for maintaining the crops, as well as chemical pesticides and fertilizers that go back into the soil, and that effectively ruins it for the future and contaminates the water supply. Like we talked about last lesson, water is not an unlimited resource. especially because we can only use fresh water to plant with. And when water gets contaminated, we can't use it again because it's really hard to uncontaminate that water. And also using lots of pesticides and fertilizers that ruins the soil because it ruins the soil quality, and ruining the soil quality is really hard to go back from because it's hard for the crops to grow in soil conditions that they aren't used to. The Amazon absorbs 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year and helps slow down the rapid rate of global warming. So if we lose the Amazon, all those tons of carbon dioxide are going to go back into the atmosphere, and that will definitely contribute to global warming. That will be terrible because not only do we no longer have the Amazon, those trees, to absorb CO2, we also lose we lose that ability to absorb it, but we also are putting back so much CO2 in the atmosphere, and that would just rapidly accelerate the rate of climate change.
Responses to deforestation. You can support green businesses such as those which are known to reuse and recycle. And this is important since recycling includes paper. And if we can reduce the amount of paper that is being produced, that will reduce the amount of trees that get cut down, which will reduce the rate of deforestation. You can also cut down on meat and dairy intake, especially red meat, because cattle ranching causes lots of forests to get cut down in order to make room to raise all of these animals to get slaughtered. And you can also compost your food waste, since landfills significantly worsen global warming through the production of methane. You can also focus on replanting, which will help restore deforested areas with hopefully more trees. And you can also organize community forestry events where people and communities come together to plant trees with local organizations.
So some more ways to respond to deforestation are to run campaigns to educate people about the harm of deforestation. And I would say this is a great one because educating people is one of the biggest ways to have the biggest impact. And additionally, you can also work with forestry and environmental organizations that have the goal of rebuilding deforested areas and regulate and propose laws that would protect forested areas, such as naming them as state or national parks, which is one of the main reasons that there are a lot of areas that are still safe, is because when they made them into state and national parks, you can't can't cut down the trees or destroy the environment in those areas.
And lastly, importance of deforestation to sustainability. So deforestation negatively affects the sustainability of the world, as many forests are needed to absorb CO2 in the atmosphere. Like I previously talked about, without those forests absorbing the CO2, that all stays in the atmosphere, and CO2 traps heat and contributes to global warming, and that would cause climate change. In order to guarantee a sustainable world, the current rate of deforestation cannot continue because many more endangered species would go extinct and global warming would increase. This is because a lot of endangered species are already losing their homes due to deforestation, and if they lose their habitat anymore, they're not going to have any place to live, and that would cause them to die. And so many species are lost every day due to deforestation. Carbon dioxide needs to be absorbed in order to slow down the rapid rate of global warming. And like I just talked about, the only way to really stop global warming and prevent climate change is to reduce the amount or completely stop any emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere.